So it's my pleasure to introduce the speaker today. This is Dr. Xiao from UCLA. He has a PhD in biomedical engineering from UCLA. He got that in 2004. He must have liked it at UCLA because he stayed there. He's currently an associate professor in residence in neurosurgery and is also affiliated with the Department of Bioengineering.
True.
His research is on biomedical signal analysis as well as in clinical informatics. And he'll be talking today to us on the real-time clinical analytics at the bedside.
Okay, thank you all. So good afternoon. It's really my pleasure to be here. We had a very interesting rain this morning. So next time if you want to rain, just call me. I'll come again. Get you some rain. Right. Okay, so I'll get started. So a quick slide just to give you an overview of my educational and career path. As you can see, it's pretty linear and stationary. I only stayed in two places. One in China, where I finished my bachelor and master degree in biomedical engineering. Then I came to US and stayed at UCLA for my PhD program. Then after that, I joined the Department of Neurosurgery, so has been there for the last 13 years. Later on, you figure out why, as a die-hard biomedical engineer, why do I have to do anything with biomedical informatics? So I have a slide to explain that. Okay. Also, kind of a background slide to give you kind of status update of what we have done since I created this neural system and dynamics lab back in December 2006. As you can see, our papers appeared in many different journals. And I think this is because the way we practice informatics or information extraction really needs us to understand the pathophysiology of the process and generate those data. So when we end up having papers in some physiological journals, in some clinical journals, as we move towards informatics, so we actually have two papers published on JBI. So here's an overview of the rest of the talk today. As I mentioned, I basically have two primary research focus. So one is very basically based in neurocritical care unit. I deal with lots of patient monitoring, decision support in that environment. And also about 1.5 years ago, I started a new direction, basically expand that kind of operation to the whole hospital for the purpose of addressing alarm fatigue, and also for providing early detection of patient deterioration before something bad happens. Then, to make all this research accessible to our end users, we really have to start developing, software systems. So I will have a last part focus on some of the things we have been doing. Okay, so just bear with me. So I guess we will take questions after the talk. So I guess I have about 50 something slides. So hopefully we will have enough time for questions and answers. So just bear with me. So I will start with kind of telling you my overarching research goal. So early on, I have been exposed to critical care, patient care, and in that kind of environment, because my PhD advisor actually set up his lab just two doors down the neurocritical care in our old hospital. So there's no reason for not get into that for the research. So as you can see here, critical care is complex. It's prone to have medical errors and very expensive. So according to some reports, it can cost up to 1% of the GDP. So it's very expensive. I think part of the issues our colleagues in critical care are dealing with is basically data explosion. All this imaging data, signals, clinical lab test results are supposed to help them make decisions, but because of not enough analytics and not enough thought in how to deliver those information, it's getting sometimes in their way of treating or managing the patient. So we need to, there's a great opportunity for bioinformatics community. And also on top of all these data explosion issues, there is actually an increasing unmet demands of intensivists as this aging population get into the next 10 or 15 years. We will see this gap is going to increase. So having said this, my overarching research goal is basically to develop advanced algorithms and systems of delivering those results from the analytics to our frontline nurses and physicians so that we can help them do their job. Okay, so it's just very simple. As I mentioned, I want to tell you why I'm coming to a bioinformatics field. So this, I think, is largely because my early years in my PhD study, I was actually, used as a software developer for my advisor. He was doing a kind of software project called Global Care Quest. So it's back in 2000. So we, at that time, at UCLA, we were using some homegrown EMR systems. So we actually have a live HL7 feed, from the hospital mainframe, so we can actually pass in the messaging and build all this data. So that was originally conceived to support some clinical trials because they want ways automatically extracting, patient demographics, lab test results. So Metaverse sees opportunity in that, because at that time, probably for most of patients right now is physicians really have to go to many different systems to grab information, to go to one system, get a notes, another system, get lab test results. So it's virtually they have to hunt for the data. So the idea of this system was actually to consolidate that in the back end into a database, something like that. And then we deliver that basically a typical client server kind of structure to different terminals. So we focus on a mobile device and a desktop. So I remember we actually made this CT scans to appear on a Palm Pilot. I don't know if you remember that very first mobile device. So we actually did. I couldn't find actually the image for that. Anyhow, so this was kind of a hands-on experience for me to really learn software engineering, programming, database. So I don't have that. I mean, I didn't have that as a biomedical engineer. So it's given me a very unique opportunity to get into this informatics world. So then, but I was there for PhD, but just delivering software would not be enough to get me a PhD degree. And also, you realize, even with this very nice dashboard, physicians really have to look for data or for information for trends. So this is really not enough. It's a right step, right? But it's not enough to really provide lots of decision support and help. So I kind of, taking a more different approach to more kind of towards analytics and algorithms. So you understand, all this clinical data, physiological data, phenotype data. What are the consumers of them? So basically our physicians and nurses. So they consume this huge amount of data, in a very non-linear way. And the output of that process is basically, some detection of, patient events or miss of them. Or most of the time, they will, based on their observation and assemble the data, come with some treatment plan, orders of drugs, things like that. Right? So for us to really help them, we need to basically have access to both the input and output of this process. In today's world, this is really kind of easy, because of the electronic capture of this data. So my idea is very, very simple. Is basically, once we have this input of data in place in an analyzable form, we can really reach out to our, the first kind of toolkit we need is basically analytic tools, signal image processing, natural language processing, mathematical modeling, and lots of things like that, and machine learning tools. But on the other hand, as I said, to really communicate with our clinical partners, we really have to also understand the anatomic and pathophysiological process of those. And we also need to learn the clinical knowledge of how the disease are managed, so we can actually see the problems. Sometimes working with physicians, you see, they can give you big pictures. They can talk a lot, but it's really up you to have engineering skill to define the problem and find a solution. I think that's where we can help. So once you have all the tools in place, you can build patients build a sensitive and specific forecast of clinical endpoints. So I will continue talking about that. So now the second portion of my presentation today is really to tell you something about what I've been doing in a neurological care environment. So I thought it would be good to start with this slide. Eventually we'll go back to the alarm business. So I want to show you this interesting statistics from our database. So this big chart is basically a monthly number of alarms from GE monitors in a 24-bed cardiac unit. So we count the number of alarms. I think this label is wrong anyway. For 7-8 months, and we compare that to to the number of alarms from critical care unit. As you probably expected, the cardiac unit has a lot more alarms. Okay, almost twice. But if you really work in your critical environment, you actually see there are a lot more devices being used to monitor the patient, because just brain is much more complex than the heart and the cardiovascular system. So I listed here a few devices we are using at UCLA, but not for every single patient, but for quite a number of patients. So why don't we have enough alarms? Because even when we have so many additional devices, I think it's very simple, because all these devices they don't have very sophisticated analytics and machine to extract the information. So they actually don't generate any out-of-table alarms, which is good for some, for avoiding adding more alarms. But it also actually create opportunity for us to really, build something on top of this, and re-engineering the alarming process. Okay, for nurses mostly. So here's my kind of thought on what is lacking in current analytics. So for those signals, we really don't have a very deep analysis of them. For example, for the intracranial pressure, ICP, the monitor just display a big number. That's mean ICP for the last 6 seconds or last 12 seconds. For the EEG, they usually just, I think for the last 15 years, people have just using the spectral analysis, looking for the powers at different frequency bands. That is really not reviewing all the interesting or meaningful pathological information. So there's lots of opportunity for us to do deeper analysis of those signals. But also, as I said, the brain is a complex organ. Really, the reason we are doing this multimodal monitoring is really to learn all the aspects of the brain. But however, we actually deliver the information, we actually do the analysis, we are kind of getting one signal at a time. There really no kind of integrated analysis of different types of signals. And lastly, all those monitors do not have any information from EMR, so they don't know the patient's age, they don't know, what's the diagnosis of the patient. So that limits, the information extraction. So now I'm going to jump, to a very specific topic, basically how to do a deep analysis of intracranial pressure. Intracranial pressure is a very important physiological variable for neurocritical care of traumatic brain injury and stroke patients. Neurosurgeons actually started ICP as early as in 40s last century. However, even by today, we have only invasive ways to measure ICP. Okay, so one of my research projects actually in finding ways to non-invasively assess ICP. So I'm not going to talk about that topic, but you understand that stuff are the only way we have to measure ICP. So drill a hole. So we can put a sensor either in the parenchyma, that's the brain tissue, or in the ventricles. Okay, and those are two popular ways or the only ways of measuring ICP. If you look at the signals, ICP is actually a very rich information. So at least you can see quite 3 different bands in frequency. So the fattest component is the pulsatile component of ICP. Each heartbeat causes a small blood volume node in the brain that causes actually ICP pulse. And if you move down the frequency spectrum, you actually will see there is actually very prominent respiratory component of the ICP, not because by either CO2 changes, things like that. But there's another component, it's called slow wave, which has a frequency usually around 1.1 hertz and even lower than that. So it's very rich in information. So clinically, physicians like to have guidelines. So there's a guideline for managing the severe traumatic brain injury patients. Based on the guideline is a level 2 evidence that if the patient's Glasgow coma score, means patient in coma that's less than 9, or there is any abnormal CT signs for the patient, then it's better to just put an ICP monitor in. If you talk to any neurosurgeon in North America, they will not be used to treating TBI patients without having ICP monitoring. But this is actually not the case in other parts of the world. For example, in China, in my home country, I don't think many hospitals are using ICP to guide TBI treatment. Even also in South America. So I will tell you a very nice story about a clinical trial that was just done in South America to show whether there's actually a benefit of having ICP monitoring as part of the protocol to treat TBI patients. Very, very interesting. And so there is a magical number, 20 millimeter mercury. So based on the guideline, if the patients, so the key of managing the TBI patients is to prevent secondary brain injury. And as a surrogate to that is basically to try to control the ICP below 20 millimeter mercury. So that's the measured in guideline. Okay. But as I said, the status quo of ICP monitoring is very rudimentary. So this is actually one of the devices we have in our ICU and in many other ICU as well. Is from Kadma. So it's ICP monitor only give you a big number, which is mean ICP for the last, I believe, 6 to 10 seconds. So our lab has really what we have done in the last few years is really to create a very robust algorithms to analyze the shape of individual ICP pulses in a very robust way. And by doing that, we were able to extract many useful features. And on top of that, we build machine learning models to detect some of the brain pathological process. And so I'll give you some examples. So this is one actually real ICP recording from a TBI patient. As you can see here, this straight line is basically the threshold. As I mentioned by the guideline, it's the treating threshold. As you can see, the nurses actually respond to the ICP elevation quite in a kind of a delayed fashion. Actually, this is not their fault. This is because part of the clinical practice is basically once the ICP alarm goes off, you're supposed to silence the alarm. And if this is true ICP elevation, the alarm will go off again in 5 minutes. Okay, so if you heard the second alarm go off, that's probably it's a true ICP elevation. So at another point, our nurses usually go to the bedside, checking the stuff, and then they turn on the drainage of the CSF, so cerebral spinal fluid. And that's basically, I forgot to mention some physiology behind that. So basically, it's a fluid in your brain and buffers the brain. By draining the cells out of the body, that's a very quick way to bring down the ICP. Here is basically what you see here. However, what our research showed that actually you don't have to wait for the ICP to go really elevated to detect the ongoing problem. What's happening now is very reactive. You basically wait for something to happen to start treating the patient. So what we want, this is a very good example of things we can do to make this towards proactive. So what we found is that there are actually very specific pulse-morphological changes as the patient develops acute ICP elevation. So we're able to actually do this analysis and build machine learning models to predict ICP elevation, giving nurses about 20 minutes of action time. Okay, so we published 2 papers on this topic. So this is a very good example of deep analysis of physiological signals. Okay, but how about the multimodality monitoring? So this is a slide to demonstrate a recent work we did by combining the EEG. EEG is basically a signal for the brain electric activity and ICP monitoring together. There is a process called neurovascular coupling. So basically, if the brain receives a stimulus, there is an increased brain activity. So basically, your neurons start firing faster, the response. And that kind of response under a preserved neurovascular coupling will cause blood vessels to dilate to deliver more energies in terms of glucose and oxygen to the brain. Okay, so this is called a neurovascular coupling. And the traditional ways of studying this is using the functional MRI. And I think that's very powerful, very good, for lots of basic science and also translational studies. But in neuro ICU, you don't have an fMR machine available, and will not be able to really track, the changes of the patient. So this is actually, I think it's 40 seconds of EEG signal. This pattern is particularly called burst suppression. Usually for severe TBI patients, the physician actually sedated the patient to induce this kind of pattern in EEG, so they can reduce the metabolic demand of the energies as a way of protecting the brain, okay, especially after brain injury. So this actually gives us an opportunity to looking for this neurovascular coupling. Why? Because you can imagine each burst here represents actually an increased brain activity. So we would expect to see some kind of hemodynamic response if the neurovascular coupling is intact. And indeed, that's what we see here. So this basically we developed an algorithm to basically segment each burst for given EEG, and this is about 10 minutes of data. And meanwhile, once we have the EEG segmented, we can actually align the ICP at the beginning of each EEG burst. Then we can look at the response of the ICP to each burst. And it's very interesting. You can actually see a kind of delayed ICP elevation to each EEG burst. So this is a scale of seconds. It's about 35 seconds in total. And the ICP response to each burst, peaked around 10 seconds. So this is well matched with what we know physiologically, okay? And because of this, so this is another, the same presentation, just put out each of the, put out ICP response to each of the bursts. You can see there's some variations, but overall, the average curve, this red curve basically shows this reserved or intact neurovascular coupling. But there are definitely some pathological states of the patient that they lost this neurovascular coupling. So this is what's being shown here. You don't see actually a response in those cases. So this is just give you an example that by doing this multimodal analysis, we were able to deliver, insights into the physiological process, and it may be undergoing changes during this patient care process. And then I think that's something that physicians really are looking for to get that kind of information to guide their treatment and management of the patient. So the summary, but we have to realize, analytics do not treat patients. It's just monitoring, next level of monitoring. So we also to really have physicians buy into this, we need to do clinical trials to especially convincing average clinical physicians to adopt this. In academic centers like UCLA or other academic hospitals, usually physicians are more willing to try out things. But if you want to go to average community clinical, you have to get more evidence. So in the end, I want to share with you a very recent development in this field. So last week I was at this neurocritical care annual meeting in Denver. So one of the highlights of this meeting was the first public presentation of a very first randomized clinical trial of intracranial pressure monitoring, which was done by a neurosurgeon in University of Washington, Seattle. I think it was funded by NIH, but the trial was actually done in South America. So do you know why this cannot be done here in US?
FDA guidelines?
Yes, guidance. So basically, it will be considered unethical to treat TBI patients without using ICP monitoring. So you cannot do a randomized control study. Anyhow, but in South America, as I said, not actually majority of the hospitals, according to this presentation, they don't actually use ICP monitoring to guide the TBI patient ICU care. So it's very interesting to see whether we can see any difference. So the design of the study was actually to compare, I think, there's two ways of managing TBI patients. So one is based on a number from the ICP. Another is based on basically frequent clinical symptoms assessment and CT imaging to detect, ICP related problems. So it's another way of kind of figuring out what ICP is going on, right? So results actually is not unexpected. Basically, no difference in terms of the outcome. Okay, after his presentation, the whole audience reacted very, positively. This actually is not to say a disapproval of ICP monitoring for the TBI. It's really to show we're not done enough yet. The number is not enough to really guide, the treatment. So this really create opportunity for, for my research to really go to next level. That's why I said the interest to test new TBI management driven by ICP pulse morphology is going to rise. So I'm really looking forward to continue this amount of research. So having, spent some time on the neurocritical care, let's move on, to kind of more hospital-wide monitoring. And so I will start. So shall I go back there? Probably not, right? So you see the problem. So this is basically a slide I bought from a colleague at UCSF. This is actually, you can see, is actually in Stanford. So that's what's usually very typical in intensive care unit. You have all these alarms go off, not just from monitors, from ventilators, from the bed, from all sorts of devices. Okay, so it's not fun to work there anyhow. And this is actually not a problem. It's not a problem just for the hospital patients. As we enter this M-health or e-health era, we're getting lots of things moving out of the hospital to monitor the patients. So this is a study I just noticed was published on this Journal of Medical Internet Research, and this is actually the journal with the highest impact in biomedical informatics. And so they published a very interesting study on basically trying to check whether having those heart failure patients with telemonitoring, whether that will improve the outcome. So they basically have those patients do the weight, blood pressure, and EKG monitoring at home, and if there's anything abnormal, they send an alert to two cardiologists in a 6 months trial period. And indeed, actually, they improved the outcome. Basically, the left ventricular ejection fraction got improved. But I kind of noticed, in this trial period, those two poor cardiologists just got many additional emails in their email box to check, right? So that's again potentially can lead to to alarm fatigue. Okay, so it's not just hospital; it's everywhere as we get people instrumented more and more outside the hospital setting. So at UCLA, we actually to do this kind of research. Remember, in my very few slides, I said we really need to capture the input-output data. So this is how we are doing this at UCLA. It's basically a combination of commercial solution and in-house customization. So we are using a system called Bedmaster. It's a funky name, but it does the job very well. So this is a piece of software that sits on the GE Unity network. So GE Unity network is also called mission critical network. So basically all the bedside monitors are on that network. They broadcast the waveform data, alarm data, vital signs. So this Bedmaster system, basically the server side sits on that network, listens to those messages, and archives the data. So they save the alarm messages, they save the vital signs in the SQL Server database, and they also archive the waveform at a sample rate of 240 Hz. So it's very, very good. So on top of that, we develop additional database objects, tables, store procedures to further automate this process and also facilitate the retrieval of the research data. So we started this kind of system back in 2007 just for neuro ICU. And about 2 years ago, I expanded that to 200 beds in our hospital. It's not complete coverage of the hospital, but did give us a very good representation of what's going on. So right now, before I came here, I did a quick database query to see what we have there. So we have more than 4,500 neuro ICU patients in that registry, and more than 17,000 patients in the whole hospital unit. So I didn't have any coverage for the pediatric patient populations, for the adult patients. In terms of alarm message, we have more than 25 million number of alarms. Okay, and also because of my experience in GCQ, so we actually also have access to the EMR data, which includes demographics, lab test results, and some nursing charted information. But more importantly, and remember, this is all like raw data. more important, we need to have the target. So in this case, I work with hospital quality management services. They actually give me a list of code blue events in hospital. And we also have ways to figure out the unplanned ICU transfers. And those are kind of initial target that we can see if we can actually detect or predict those events. So that's so even before we develop, we delve into some analytics, we can actually do some visualization for our bedside nurses. So this is one application we just finished, which will be piloted in ICU, in one of the ICU, the cardiac ICU. So this is, I don't know if any of you had any experience in hospital. So basically, right now, the monitors just, go off. They beep to tell you there's alarm. And that's it. There's no way to communicate historical information about the alarm to nurses. So you basically sits there or stands there responding to individual alarm one at a time, which is not very good, from human factor engineering point of view. So what we came up with is kind of, a rendering of, for a given patient, all the alarms within last, let's say, 24 hours or last shift, so that they can get a sense of context of what's really going on. For example, if they see lots of arrhythmia alarms, they can probably prompt to either check the electrodes to see whether those alarms are false, or they can actually check the lab test results to looking for abnormal electrolytes that can cause arrhythmia, right? So and also we also graph the vital signs using the spark line, so we can really appreciate the trend. So this application is meant to run as a screensaver for each of the nursing workstation outside ICU bed. So we give them this kind of overview of the patient status. So there's no analytics behind that, but as you can see, once we have this in the unit, we can really, on top of that, build additional rendering based on, analysis results. So that's what I hope to continue this. So moving beyond simple visualization, what we need to do really some, algorithms to help the nurses or physicians. So in this particular case, I did a study to basically mine just the alarm data, and we call this super alarm. So super alarm is basically a combination of individual regular monitor alarms that occur consistently across patients within a short time window. So if we want to build a super alarm to predict or detect ongoing patient deterioration, for example, for code blue, we would like those super alarm to happen very frequently preceding a code blue events, but meanwhile not so frequently for control patients, right? So this is understandable. We want something more specific for this particular events, and we can take the similar philosophy to build super alarm for different endpoints, sepsis, IQ lung injury, those kind of events in the hospital. So we published this recently Journal of Biomedical Informatics. So to tell you how this was done, I'd like to just provide some additional background on patient monitor alarm. So there are two major vendors, GE and Philips. There is another vendor from China. They have big presence in China, but not here. Anyhow, so for the GE system, there are two types of alarms. So one is about the patient, one is about the device. You have electrodes off, you have a battery, it's gone. So for the patient alarms, there are 4 different levels. The most urgent one is called a crisis. There are only 3 permanent crisis alarms for GE monitors. One is a systolic, basically the heartbeat stops. You can see a 3-line in EKG. And also ventricular fibrillation is a deathly ECG arrhythmia alarm. Then you have apnea. Anyhow, then going down, then you have patient warning level alarm, patient advisory level alarm, and message level. So only the message level alarm will not have any beeping sound. So the crisis we have 3 beeps, and the warning alarm we have 2 beeps, and advisory alarm we have 1 beep. Okay, so there also another way to look at alarm is there are also ECG arrhythmia alarm to tell you there's a type of ECG arrhythmia going on, but there are also parametric alarms like this one, AR1, SYS, LO80. So what it means, it basically means systolical arterial blood pressure is too low when its value is 80 millimeter mercury. Okay, depending on some preset threshold, this will be triggered. Okay, and that's how monitors generate those parametric alarms. Really, this the key behind this super alarm concept is very simple. It's basically an algorithm to identify the frequent item sets. I can use this simple slide to just tell you, what this algorithm is, but in reality, the challenge is really to have computationally efficient algorithms to deal with millions of alarms. But for terms of the principle, it's very easy to understand. So let's assume we have 3 cases of code blue, and we want to only look at a time window that is 30 minutes immediately preceding the code blue. Okay, and assuming for the case 1 we have only found 3 alarms, which is unrealistic. But for the case 2, we only have 2 alarms, and for the case 3, another 2 alarms. Then we kind of list all the combinations of those alarms we have found in the database, and we're looking for kind of how frequently they happen in those 3 cases. So here, for example, for the ventricular tachycardia, it happens very frequent for those code blue patients, 3 out of 3. Then for the SpO2, this pulse X, less than 88, this kind of alarm only happened in 1 of the case. Okay, so you can basically go on to count this. As I mentioned before, one of the requirements for super alarm is that it needs to be frequent for the code blue cases, so we can use a spreadsheet to pick the frequent alarm combinations. Okay, so that's what we do at the first step to find the candidates. So it's basically what I described in this flow chart for the whole thing on this side. So taking the code blue cases, we go through this frequency item set mining, we find the candidates for super alarm. However, we need to also utilize the control data set to filter also those candidates that happen also frequently for the for the control patients. So this is basically what I did in terms of the algorithm for the super alarm. And there are a few free parameters that can affect the performance of this. There are about 5 of them, so I will not go into detail. You can check out the paper. This is basically the summary of kind of the database I used at that time to do this study. So today we actually already have a large database. We continue this. So in that paper, I reported results from using 150 adult code blue patients, and most of them actually are cardiac arrest, and most of them actually happened in the ICU, which is very unfortunate because in the ICU the patients are closely watched. Usually you should not have any unexpected code blue in ICUs. This is not acceptable. We also use the following criteria to find the control patients. So their age has to be within 5 years, has to be in the same sex, and they need to stay in the same unit. And they also have the same major diagnostic code, and it has not to be unplanned ICU transfer patients. So as a result of those criteria, we have about 900,000 alarms for code blue cases, and we have about 5 million alarms for control patients. And this is basically a flow chart I had in the paper to illustrate the experiment protocol. In doing machine learning, in doing data mining, it's very critical to make sure you don't overfit the data and you have a sense of how generalizable the results are. So in doing so, we basically we separate our data set into a test data set and a training data set. So 80% will be used for figuring out the sensitivity and the optimal parameter settings. The way to do that, we basically use cross-validation, and we generate multiple copies of tenfold cross-validation validation data set. The reason for that is because we want to have a sense of how sensitive our parameters to, the results, how sensitive the results to those parameters. So we did basically analysis of variance ANOVA with the sensitivity. So that's why we need to create multiple copies of cross-validation data set. This is actually not very typically done in this field. Anyhow, So looking at the automatic device, so using the training data, we basically can figure out offline performance. So basically, we need to sample for the control page. We need to sample some alarms in random fashion from those patients, so now becomes kind of offline performance. And you can imagine as you increase your false positive rate, you actually also increase the sensitivity. So you see what we see here. So FPR is false positive rate you want your system to have. Of course, you want a smaller FPR, but of course you have to sacrifice your sensitivity. So this is offline performance, which is not our ultimate metric to measure this super online performance. So what really matters is actually the online performance, which I will explain later. Anyhow, so this is just to give you an example of what we have found under a particular parameter setting. So you did see there, we found combinations of different types of alarms. It shows, the power of this kind of automated data mining process to looking for meaningful multivariate alarms. Okay. So what really matters is really to take this offline finding to apply them on a totally new data set. So in this case, we have a data reserved from the full data sets that were from 33 cold blue patients and 340 control patients. So we are interested in two metrics. The first metric is basically sensitivity of predicting cold blue, which you have to understand is going to be a function of the prediction time. Okay, so I'll explain that. Then we also care about the false positive ratio. So in this case, we really want to compare the number of false super alarms to the actual conventional monitor alarms. So we come up with this metric, the ratio of hourly number of false positive super alarm to that of monitor alarms. So the way to operate this in online fashion is the following. So let's say at a given time we received a new monitor alarm. Okay, then we go back use a historical window to looking for whether there's any matching of the historical alarms with our super alarm patterns. If there's any of them, then we'll say, okay, there is potentially a cold blue going to happen. So to measure the sensitivity, you're only going to focus on the coded patients, and because of that, there is a very trivial way to predict. You can say because you know this patient will you're going to have cold blue. So if your prediction time window is infinity, your sensitivity will be 100%. Do you agree? Do you say that? Right. But it will be useless, right? It will be useless. So what we have found is the following. So the sensitivity function, as I said, is going to be a function of time, and this is 4 curves on the different maximally error in the false positive way. Again, when you have a higher false positive, means you can tolerate more false alarms, you will have a higher sensitivity. Okay. So what's interesting to look at the false super alarm ratio, what we found is that even if we want to use kind of a poor false positive ratio of 15%, we actually was able to have a sensitivity of 90% of predicting cold blue, while we were able to actually avoid about 90% of the false monitor alarms. I think that's quite promising. If we can further move this, towards a higher number, and we'll maintain, high sensitivity. And there are ways to do that. What we have done is just the beginning. So right now we are also looking into ways to integrate, lab test results. So we're going to start with, 23 map panels, the most conventional ones, and also, garbage in, garbage out. We know there are many false alarms, right? So if you try to leverage those false alarms, you're doomed to have some false positives. So now we develop ways to go back to the waveform, and for a given alarm, we analyze the waveform data associated with that alarm to really tell you whether that alarm should be trusted or not. Okay, so using this kind of filter, we'll be able to remove false alarms. So we're going to deal with this, one modality at a time. We start with ICP, and we move on to EKG, to ABP. So there's a plan, being executed at the moment. And also, this is a paradox. We are complaining about we're complaining about having so many alarms, but indeed, actually, monitors are not giving you all the information you actually need to managing some of the locations. For example, the EKG, the one of the parameters is called QT interval. It's a very important number to have, especially if your patients are under anti-arrhythmia drugs, because it's the prolonged QT interval is a very sensitive specific risk factor for deadly arrhythmias. But none of the monitors deliver that, even though they already have access to the ECG waveform. So potentially we can, again, using our deep waveform analysis to extract additional parameters and to add them to be part of the super alarm. And also we can looking for the sequential patterns there. The orders of the alarms also matters. So I haven't actually right down here, but that's definitely one of the directions we go is we are trying to push forward the front line of this. Okay, so now I'm trying to tell you a little bit about the software aspect of our research. So basically, I see two ways to do this. So we are also having some very small in-house software development team. So we came up with this design of plug-and-play predictive model hosting platform. So we are, piece by piece, we are putting together. It's very challenging. But more recently, I started to collaborate with IBM folks because they are very, very low in this data, big data, right? So we're going to try their platforms. I'll tell you what that is. So first thing about our homegrown system is called plug-and-play predictive model hosting. So this is basically kind of a conceptual diagram. So on the right side of the screen, we have all this data source. So what we hope is we can build some kind of a data adapter, to EMR, to monitors. So we can grab the data into this P3MP system. So as you can imagine, the high frequency data will be saved as waveform files. Other data will be basically saved as using relational database to save them. And on the left side of this, basically are our target users. So modelers like myself, and physicians, nurses. So what we want to do is basically we want to focus on model development. So we don't want to be bothered about how to grab the data, how to normalize the data. So that's why I hope this plug-and-play platform will be able to facilitate, the real-time operation of analytics. And for physicians, they can basically subscript, use this publish subscription, pattern to whatever services they are interested. So in terms of software modules, that's what we have is basically services architecture-oriented. We have a bunch of services to handle different aspects of the software, and they're also loosely coupled because we usually adhere to the interface programming. So that's the key. Even on the client side, we have to also make sure that those individual dialogues or modules can be also operated in a plug-and-play fashion. So we're using some well-known patterns called composite application development pattern to develop the whole system. So each individual analytics can be plugged into this general framework. But the challenge there, so we have a very small software team. So this system is very complex if we don't do things right. So we don't want to miss the opportunity to make this happen. So we start talking to the IBM folks. And especially they have a new product. It's called IBM InferSphere Streams. So traditionally, we do data analysis, so our TP and online analytics platform is all about data at rest. So the stream is really about data at motion. So you have all the sensors data coming at high frequency. You have all the social feeds and Twitters you need to analyze on the fly. So that's what this IBM Stream system is supposed to do to help you, run analytics. So basically, it's a programming model. You need to actually learn a new language to get things tied together. So this is actually a very good illustration of what it has. So basically, each of the circle is something called operator. So operator is like our function. It's actually is above the function. So inside operator, you can have multiple sequence of functions to perform one particular task. Then you can group all these operators into called processing unit. So this is basically to scale up the operation. So each process unit will be handled by one process. Okay, and then you can use the data stream to connect all these operators modules together. So it's basically what they have in IBM Stream. So as said, it has a language. So this is basically what you have to define a joint operator and using some of the the template stuff. But also you can actually graphically visualize what you want to do. So all these lines represent the input data, output data stream. It could be in waveform, could be database records. And you can tie all these operators together to perform one particular analysis. I think it's going to be very powerful. And also streams has some built-in toolkit in some basic stuff, try to filter records, can sort records, and it also has a bunch of data mining and text mining tools that's available. But for our proof of concept POC project user A, our goal is really to demonstrate two things. So first, to demonstrate we can actually connect the streaming platform to our real-time data source from the bedmaster to actually get stream data into the system. And secondly, we want to demonstrate we can at least demonstrate one existing algorithm for more than one patient. So this is a really simple proof of concept project. So the approach we are taking is also very simple. So we're going to use our existing bedmaster to develop adapter, like what I had for my P7P kind of platform. Use adapter to grab the data. And also we already have the algorithm in C++, so we don't want to re-implement this algorithm in the stream language called SPL. So one advantage of having IBM Stream that it actually can give you an interface to basically pipe out this algorithm into a function. So you can actually treat it as native stream functions in this whole workflow. So this is what we had. It's really each job will handle the data from one patient. So for 24 beds, we have 24 jobs. But fortunately, the whole IBM Stream system is very scalable. It actually, we can just deploy this on a workstation or on a cluster. It really doesn't matter. They handle all the underneath job scheduling and load balancing. So it's a very scalable platform. So we are going to test this, I think, in a couple of weeks in real time. So really, to summarize all this, things I've been doing, I think this slide will give you probably a clear picture. So on the hospital side, we really have data, from EMR, and we will have all sorts of, devices that generate signals, alarms, things like that. So what we really need is a kind of middleware solution that sits on top of this. That as modelers, we can use our retrospective analysis to build models and develop in a kind of analytics. And we need to have either P7P or the IBM InfoShare streaming as a platform to execute all these individual analytics. One aspect I haven't touched in this presentation is basically we also need to engage additional machine learning paradigms to basically be able to to fine-tune, to adapt those analytics once they are deployed. So there are active learning, semi-supervised learning paradigms that we can leverage to do these things. And eventually we're going to work with other people on this team, like human factor engineers, who really find ways to deliver these results to our end users in a user-friendly and effective way. So this is basically my view of the whole ecosystem of developing this advanced analytics for the next generation of patient monitoring. And with that, I thank you for being here. And this is the team back in March. Some have already graduated, so it's already changed. Anyhow, so now I can take some questions. Have some water first.
for the nice talk. I have a question about this multimodal study.
Mm-hmm.
So EEG is kind of correlated.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know if the people
Okay.
who broadcast can pick it up with that.
Thank you.
Oh, they can?
I'm not sure if
we
these are
can
on.
press these buttons.
Which button?
On the
Oh, yeah. Okay. And so EEG is correlated with the both signal generated by fMRI. But what is this physiological correlation between EEG and the intracranial pressure?
Okay, so let me answer that. So EEG basically is a signal for the brain electric activity, right? So ICP is, so let me get into ICP. So ICP is basically, in my mind, it can actually reflect the hemodynamics and volume changes. So what you see that delayed elevation of ICP in response to each burst is because of vasodilatation. So vasodilatation increases the volume of the blood volume. And because of the skull is rigid, there's no place to really accommodate that volume, right? So that actually causes ICP elevation. Now, if you see the link, it's basically the EEG increased EEG activity as burst. If your neurovascular coupling is intact, that will cause vasodilatation. So the vessels basically dilate, so the radius increase, and that increase the blood volume, and the need for ICP increase.
So does it mean that ICP reflects like more global change?
Yes, this is a global change. The fMRI is really for regional analysis, right? So yeah.
Thank you.
Good capture.
Just a related question. So do you see it in all of the EEG channels, or are there particular scalp locations where you see it better?
In this particular case, it's actually global. So every channel has the same burst suppression pattern because remember this is a patient under sedation, right?
Okay.
So control their ICP, reduce their metabolic demands.
Okay. And then another question: on your super alarm, what's sort of the time criticality of getting it? Like, is 10 minutes prior to the code blue much better than having it 5 minutes prior to the code blue, or at what point is it really important to have that alarm?
Okay, I think that really let me answer that question here. I think one of the drawbacks of this study is we basically treat every single code blue as the same, but it's not true. Code blue is a very generic term, so for this study we lumped it together because we have very few cases. 150 is nothing for data mining. In reality, there are different types of code blue. You have cardiac arrest, you have respiratory arrest. So within a cardiac arrest, you even have a different kind of arrest. You have PEA, you have ventricular fibrillation, and you have bradycardiac arrest. Right? So for each of them, the dynamics is very different. Okay, and depending on intrinsic dynamics of things changing, the super alarm needs to adapt with a different adapt window. So in general, I think the longer the better, but it shouldn't be infinity. If you tell the nurse is the patient going to have code blue infinity, so they cannot do anything about that. And also depends on type of category. For example, there are categories that they can do something actually to intervene, but there are other things they probably cannot do anything because we found for the PEA type of categories, the outcome is very bad. I think only 5% of patients have survived after discharge. So that's really more about end of stage care. It's not really about you can really not rescue patients. So it's lots of implications there. It's not just prediction or detection. You really consider all the other factors. Okay.
Hi there. I have a
Yeah.
few questions if you don't mind. So in the super alarms, for which there seem to be, I don't know, maybe 30 different metrics or different measures or individual alarms, are you trying to incorporate or develop algorithms that would incorporate many of those individual discrete signals into a super, if you will,
right,
decision tool?
So I think I didn't explain this very well. So the superalarm is a very generic concept. So my approach is we start with just monitor alarms. Let's find out, because there are probably hundreds of different type of monitor alarms. So let's try to find out the combination from monitor alarms. As I mentioned in the presentation, the next step is really to also integrate, abnormal lab test results, because that really can add something there, right? Then the next step is really to, as you suggested, to do to add additional metrics from EKG, from blood pressure. And so the monitor really help deliver all the information on potentially useful to the monitor. So we have lots of potential there to grow this super alarm idea. Then on top of all this, you have really to think about, what really matters is probably the sequential firing patterns of those super alarms, right? Not a single one of them. So right now I'm actually trigger based on just one, super alarm match. So potentially you probably have to looking for sequence of them, right? So there's a whole lot to do.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, you probably would start with something that's kind of a low-hanging fruit for which there's really standardized interoperability between it and others, like that, middleware that, easy to stuff something in there.
Sure.
And then over time you might be able to identify patterns out of, I don't know, 30, 100, some different modes and alarms, different patterns that, the smaller the number, the better, I suppose, but different patterns that would provide to you better and better decision making.
So hopefully, by doing this, we probably will learn some new, unexpected physiology from all this. That'll be interesting to really look into.
And then the second question that might be a little tangential. It seems like the intracranial pressure is reduced, among other things, through a reduction in spinal fluid. Is that correct?
There are all sorts of treatment. It's basically a hierarchy of treatment. So, the worst case, they can actually take a bone flap from your scalp. Yeah, so that's called craniotomy.
But if the ICP really is I imagine it can be quite an accurate kind of device.
Yeah, very accurate. You cannot say anything about that.
And it would seem like over time, this maybe is a jump forward, but along with other metrics, one could almost develop a constant pressure holding pen. As pressure built up, cerebral final fluid was pumped out into a holding area that was your spinal fluid that was kept sterile, and if needed was pumped back in, depending on some very...
What you described already exists. It's called Xiao, but it's not used for TBI. It's used for treating hydrocephalus. Yeah, so basically they diverge some of the CSF to different parts of the body, to the atrium of the heart or to the abdominal space. But it's very simplistic. There's no actual feedback control to regulate that flow. It's really just pressure difference. So once ICP is above preset values, it opens the valve and drains on CSF. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So thank you very much again for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I've had some similar experience in the past. So, and I think we'll also meet this afternoon, so we have a chance to discuss that. So just a curiosity, have you ever heard of, how do you relate to the discipline called complex event processing?
Complex event processing. Can you give me one example? Maybe
it's maybe you never heard it. It's a field which deals exactly with a field of research which deals exactly with this kind of problems. Detecting, defining, modeling events in time, recognizing them as patterns and applying decisions and conclusions.
Okay.
And that is the
So let me see what I can try to relate. Okay, so those events, alarms, actually point process, right? So they basically, it's like point in time.
Yeah.
Right. So what I've found in other industry like energy or aviation, they actually when you have a big plant, chemical plant running, you have all sorts of sensors. They actually deal with similar problem.
That's my background, by the way.
Ah, now I see what you mean. So they deal with similar problems. So they're actually looking for combination of events. Again, I think that industry is ahead of healthcare as usual. We are kind of falling behind. So it's really we can learn a lot from that. I think the sequence matching, using string kernels to really looking for distance between two sequences is the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not just sequencing, but maybe even more complex patterns
right.
and even different levels of abstractions. You have one complex type, which is the super alarm. You may have the super alarm,
right.
different combinations. So yeah, definitely.
So there's a lot to do, but not many people actually realize that. They just get used to this, monitor alarm one at a time. That's not good.
Understandable. We'll have a great discussion later.
Good. I look forward to that.